Good evening or good night for Slovenes or for Europeans. My name is Aleš Nitzel. It's a special evening or a special night or a special day for me because my guest today is after quite a long time, infamous Jared Taylor. Jared Taylor, dear Jared, thanks once again for accepting my invitation. It's always a pleasure and an honor when you do that.
Oh, you're so kind to invite me on your program.
Yeah, it's as I said, it's pleasure. It's how would a Slovene nationalist and a white nationalist from Europe not want to invite a practically a father or a uncle every white nationalist would want to have on his channel. So Jared, I think that we're pretty far now that we can, we're far enough now that we can say that we have results of American midterm elections, where the mainstream media, if I may say so, they had hypothesized that the Republicans will be the winners of this election. They had plenty of reasons for that. For example, it always happens like that, but it obviously didn't happen. What went wrong, or what happened?
Well, I'm certainly no expert on the political system in the United States, but from what I can see, the Democrats were very highly motivated by several things. One was the fact that the Supreme Court has returned the whole question of abortion right back to the states. So every state will have to decide for itself whether abortion is to be legal in that state. And this is something that motivates a surprisingly large number of American voters, especially women. And the Democrats made this a very important part of their campaign. They said a vote for the Democrats is a vote for women's rights, women's health, a woman's right to choose. Another thing that the Democrats did, which may or may not have been successful, and that is to say that a vote for the Democrats was a vote for democracy. They have completely mischaracterized what happened on January 6th of 2021 when there was the riot at the American Capitol building. They have called those people haters of democracy, haters of the American system, insurrectionists. And to a surprising degree, this characterization has stuck with Democratic voters. And I can't tell you how many columnists in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or people on the television, MSNBC, how many of them were saying that a vote for the Democrats is a vote for democracy, and a vote for the Republicans, as Joe Biden himself put it, is a vote for semi-fascism. This is completely crazy. The people who were at the Capitol and who were marching into the Capitol after the riot, they were not opposing democracy. They are in favor of democracy. They think that the voters' will should be submitted to. But they were also convinced that there had been a stealing of the election. They are in favor of democracy that works, but right or wrong, they were convinced that Donald Trump had won the election, and they were active in the name of preserving democracy against those who wanted to take it away. But the Democrats and the major media have been very successful in presenting these people as hostile to the very democratic process itself. At the same time, many Democrats and the Democratic media were predicting that on election day, there would be possibly violence at the polls, that these wicked white people armed with their semi-automatic assault rifles would be at the polls intimidating people and trying to prevent them from voting. This didn't happen at all. This is completely cuckoo. But this idea that voting for Republicans is voting for fascism, that's one thing that I think probably influenced a number of Democrats to go to the polls and to vote for their fellow Democrats. And then the third factor had to do with Donald Trump. As you know, probably Donald Trump is the most hated man in all of American history. I don't think even Benedict Arnold, who is one of the great traitors in American history, has the kind of visceral hatred against him that Donald Trump has against him, certainly by people in the media and by the Democrats. And to the extent that Donald Trump was involved in this, boosting candidates, I don't think that helped the Republicans. At this point, Republicans would do much better if Donald Trump simply faded away. But Donald Trump does not have a personality that would permit him to fade away, even if it is for the good of the country or for the good of the Republican Party. Donald Trump really cares, number one, about Donald Trump. He would like to be president again, and he is going to be involved for as long as he can influence people. And then another factor is that some of the people that he recommended were simply unacceptable to the majority of voters. He endorsed candidates who were all in agreement that the 2020 election had been stolen, the system is rotten, and I think most Americans at this point want to move forward. They don't want to go over and over and over again this question of whether or not the 2020 election was stolen. And if you have a candidate for the Senate, a candidate for a governor who is making that a centerpiece of his campaign, harping on that, that's not going to be attractive to anybody but the most committed, hard-boiled Republican voters. So that's my general view. But again, I am no expert on the American political process. And as a matter of fact, I don't really pay that much attention to it. I'm interested in how the outcome is going to affect the country, whether or not the Republicans have a majority or the Democrats have a majority. But the individual races for governor, for state house, for Congress, they don't interest me all that much. It's the outcome that may have an effect, but the individual races, often people get very excited about them, but I don't.
No, this is obviously how the Democrats and Republican vote, the Democrat and Republican voters think. But what is your opinion on this conflicts inside the Republican Party between Trump and other Republicans who want to get rid of them, and as you said, are probably right that it would be good for the Republican Party for Trump to vanish, for example. But is what is good for the Republican Party also good for our interest? Is if by us I mean white people, European people,
Yes.
Americans that are descendants of European people. I mean, it's obvious that the majority of Europeans or the Americans with European descent vote for the Republicans. But it is also obvious that this party doesn't say it out loud, that this is its base. They are, their opinion of white people is practically similar or the same as the view of the Democrats, except that some Democrats have this distorted view of white people as being something bad for American
Yes.
civilization broadly.
Yes. No, that's a very important question. And that is one of the reasons why I don't really pay that much attention to American politics, because even the Republicans, if the Republicans are in power, they're not going to stop the dispossession of whites. They may slow it down, but there is not a single Republican in elected office anywhere in the United States at any level that I know of who is prepared to say, well, hold on. This country was established for white people. It was established with the idea that this is going to be an outpost of Western civilization. And if it ceases to be majority white, if it ceases to be an outpost for Western civilization and is simply up for grabs for whoever can manage to break into the country, then it's not the United States anymore. And we really have to start over. No one is prepared to say that. No one in elective office in the United States today is even prepared to say, well, hold on. The reason blacks and Hispanics don't do as well in the United States as white people is because on average they have lower IQs. This is obvious, and this is crucially important. Instead, the Democrats say the reason blacks and Hispanics don't do as well is because of systemic racism, because of unconscious racism, institutional racism, all kinds of racism, and it's white people's fault. The Republicans don't dare say anything. They're simply silent. They don't dare say, no. The reason blacks and Hispanics don't advance is because of their own limitations and because of their own inability to plan ahead. The United States is a remarkably unracist, anti-racist country. So the inability to make this point means that all white people are constantly on the defensive, even Republicans, because they will not stand up and say, no, this country is not the least bit racist. The reason you people are not getting ahead is not our fault, it's your fault. And until Americans are prepared to say that, they will constantly be making excuses for things, unable to defend their own interests. And so that's why the question you raise is a very important one. Are even the Republicans any good for white people in the United States or around the world? And the answer is no, they are not any good, but they are less bad.
Yeah, maybe. I do think that it's still debatable. I mean, there's this idea spread through the Republican collective mind that you have to be against the Democrats hating on white people and practically loving black people and promoting this Marxist idea that only whites can be whites can
Racist, you mean?
can be racist because they have
Yes.
power and because blacks don't have power. Although I don't think it's that much different nowadays. And it's another good question: is who are the whites who have power? Are they Anglo-Saxons? Are they the WASP
Yeah.
community? Are they the Catholics? Or are they a certain European tribe that
Well,
also came? Yeah,
WASPs have, to a very large degree, been shoved aside. And probably you could argue that the new power elite in the United States is Jewish people. They have an inordinate amount of power in the United States. But being Jewish does not excuse you from being white. There was a time when, if there were talk about affirmative action in a university, and a department had to decide, okay, who are we going to hire for the next open slot? Then the Jews might say, well, we can still hire a Jew because Jews aren't white. No, not anymore. If you are Jewish and you're looking for a job and the word is out, we need diversity. No. Jews are white as far as that's concerned. So there is definitely a complete shift in who is in charge of the United States. But if you go to a city like Baltimore, or you go to a city like Detroit, the people who run the place are black. The people with the power are black. And all of a sudden, because they have power, now do they have racism? But if they are not in power, they don't have racism? This is just completely nutty stuff. It is simply a way to try to, again, pin evil exclusively on white people. Anything that ever goes wrong for non-whites is the fault of white people. So are Republicans able to stand up for that? In a very wimpy, lily-livered sort of way, they may say, well, the illegitimacy rate among black people, that's a real problem. And until illegitimacy is controlled, then, we're going to have these problems of crime and welfare use. They would never dare say, look, the average IQ of black people is 85. You can't expect them to do any better than they're doing now. In fact, many black people are doing as well as they're doing because of racial preferences, because of discrimination against white people. So the question of who runs the country and do black people have power? Of course, in many places they have a great deal of power. And in many cases, once they get that power, they exercise it very, very diligently in the interests of their own people, not in the general interest of Americans at large.
I I watched you on that show debating or initiating a debate with a this black social scientist, as he called himself in front of you. He bragged. He told you that he was a social scientist, and you debated about what is the cause of IQ, and he said that he was supposedly a professor. I don't know where, in high school or primary or school, or on college or university or wherever. But he told you that he was teaching his students that it's all about environment. Uh,
Yes, yes.
and he had such a funny argument. He said that they did an experiment with some children, and they lied to them that they had good results, and as a result of them lying to them, having good results, they went on having better results. As in, this proved that if you motivate people enough or good enough or in um, good enough manner, then they have better results. And although this does not say anything about IQ broadly, of course.
Well, his claim was that simply by telling ordinary students that they were gifted, simply telling them this and making them believe this meant that their IQs did increase. They got better grades, and some of them scored as many as 20 points higher on IQ tests. This goes back to a study in the 1960s. And the authors of this study wrote it up in a book called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Now, Pygmalion is a figure from Greek mythology, and he sculpted a sculpture, and the sculpture of a woman was so beautiful, he fell in love with this beautiful sculpture. And the sculpture's name was Galatea. Well, the gods took pity on Pygmalion, and they brought this statue to life. And apparently, Pygmalion and Galatea lived happily ever after. So the idea is you build this wonderful sculpture and it will come to life. That's the whole idea of telling people, even if they're not gifted, even if they're not smart, that they are super smart. And then that's all it takes, and they will become smart. Well, this was a very, very famous thing in the 1960s. It has never been replicated because obviously this is baloney. And as one of the critics said, if a clock strikes 13, then you have to doubt about the accuracy of every time it has struck an hour before. Once it strikes 14, then you throw the clock away. Well, this is a clock that should be thrown away. And every single one of these efforts to try to manipulate the environment in a way to raise IQ, to take ordinary people and make them perform like gifted people, has failed. And as I said to this alleged Dr. Ritchie at the time, if it were as easy as that, this would be happening every day in every single classroom in the country. Everybody would be told, oh, you're gifted, you're wonderful. And then all of a sudden, they would become gifted. If it were as easy as that, everybody would be doing it. Of course, it's not. And as I say, this Pygmalion in the classroom business has never been replicated, and probably who knows how those two guys originally got their data, but it is pure, unadulterated baloney.
There was another baloney he used as an argument. It was him mixing the two different things. He was talking about Chinese and their IQs in China, and you were talking about Chinese or Asian people taking IQ tests in America. So
Yeah.
the Asian immigrants to America, taking American IQ tests, and he was obviously persuaded that Asian students, the children of Asian immigrants in America, take different culturally more appropriate to them IQ test. This is baloney, isn't it?
I don't know what he was talking about, frankly. I believe it's very odd. It seems to me that he is completely against the concept of IQ. And he seems to believe that anyone's IQ can be improved as much as 20 points simply by telling him, you're a genius. That's all it takes. And yet, I think during the program, he himself said that his IQ is higher than mine. So how can you disbelieve in the concept of IQ and then tell someone my IQ is higher than yours? I guess he believes that when he was a little boy, his parents said, you're a genius. But my parents did not tell me I'm a genius. Well, it's true. They never told me I'm a genius. And I guess that's why his IQ is higher than mine. No, I didn't really understand what was going on there. But he at least did recognize that there are Asian groups that score higher on average on IQ tests than whites. And that's a very important part of the data, because invariably, and I believe as he pointed out, these tests were invented 100 years ago by white people. And he seemed to think they were designed explicitly and specifically to give white people higher scores than anybody else in the world. Well, they don't give white people the highest scores. They give East Asians the highest scores. And if the whole of American society is designed to keep non-white people down, or BIPOCs, as we now call them, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOCs, that includes Asians. If American society is full of white privilege, systemic racism in favor of whites, how come Asians have higher incomes? How come they're less likely to commit crime? How come they're less likely to be on welfare? How come they're so much more likely to get into Harvard or Yale or MIT? We have this white supremacist society. It's just not working. Look at how it fails. All of these Asians are defeating the system. Is this because we have some sort of yellow supremacist system? No, it's also dopey. In the United States, there are about 13,000 different school districts in the United States. 13,000. In every single one of them, the people who get the top grades and the best standardized test scores are Asians. Then come whites, then come Hispanics, and then come blacks. 13,000. In every single one of those 13,000 districts are the people who are administering the test or doing the teaching. Are they all conspiring in some sort of profoundly, fiendishly clever way to make sure that Asians do better, and then whites, then Hispanics, then blacks? No. The simplest explanation, the obvious explanation, is clearly the correct one. It's that there are differences in ability. And until the country accepts this, we will continue to be marching down this road to total, utter insanity and ultimately to the suicide of white people.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you tell them about IQ superiority of Asians, they don't have any problems. They do with whites IQ, and such people, I will say such people. I don't mean by that. I don't mean black people. I mean left thinking or progressive thinking or blank slate thinking people also have no problems when, for example, Jordan B. Peterson says Ashkenazi Jews have 115 IQ in average, which is not true. Which is not true. I mean, they as I'm aware of, if I went to see some studies, Ashkenazi Jews have average European IQ. But okay, we can debate that. We can go into studies and we can analyze studies and see into the problem. But yeah, it seems that the only problematic group in the world and the only group you can talk about without any hesitation, without any taboos, is white people.
Yes. In the United States, we're supposed to be battling negative stereotypes. Well, everybody trades in negative stereotypes about white people all the time. White people are inherently racist. White people are naturally and incorrigibly racist. And even the Smithsonian Institution, which is the national system of museums in Washington, D.C., and in a few other places in the United States, we have a museum of African American history and culture. And it put up a big a kind of a table of all of the bad things white people do, just naturally and inherently, because they're white. This is the official doctrine in the United States, and not just in the Smithsonian, that white people are basically racist, white people are a problem, and so the United States has to go out of its way on all occasions to make sure that more non-whites are hired. And sometimes they extend this to homosexuals or women. But the real obstacle is white men. White men are basically the cancer of human history. Susan Sontag, who is a Jewish writer back in 1967, before it was even cool to hate white people, she was saying the white race is the cancer of human history. Now, this is really an astonishing thing to say. If you were to say that the Jewish people were the cancer of human history, oh boy, you'd be out the door in no time at all. Or if blacks are the cancer of human history, anybody at all, you can say that about white people. And she was not denied her usual access to all the big public media and the magazines at the time. The other thing is, now, white people, Jewish or not, some of them, many Gentile whites, also take this view that white people are somehow a scourge. This is something that would be unimaginable in any other race or society. There's a woman, I believe her name is Julie Porter, something like that, Julie Ward. In any case, she is a woman who became famous here in the United States because she tried to cook all of the more than 500 recipes in a famous French cookbook in 1 year. And she wrote about this, and this was made into a movie, quite a popular movie. Well, she died recently, but among her tweets, she said such things as, it would be perfectly rational simply to kill all white people. And if we were being slaughtered in the streets, I can see the argument for doing that. And she's not joking about this. She's in effect saying white people are really the scourge of humanity, and we'd be doing the planet a power of good if we just exterminated them all. Now, can you imagine a Chinese person, say a moderately successful and not obviously insane Chinese person, saying something like that about China? To say, gosh, the world would be so much better off if every one of us were exterminated. That would be a candidate for someone to go to the psych ward, to the nut house. But in the United States, this sort of goes, oh, well, ho-hum, okay, yes, no, she's a good progressive. No, we understand, yes, white people are a real problem. So we live in an utterly insane time. And I like to think that at least in your part of the white world, in Europe, that there is not quite so much insanity of this kind as in Western Europe and in the United States. And as I've often said, these utterly suicidal, horrible, self-loathing ideas tend to start right here in my country, in the United States of America. And then they poison Western Europe. And then after they've poisoned Western Europe, they start poisoning Eastern Europe. I hope that this process can come to an end, and that at least East Europeans will realize that they are part of a wonderful culture, far from being the cancer of human history. White people have contributed by far the most to science, to culture, to all of the things that people aspire to. So, but yes, this has been a problem in the United States and continues to be. And to get back to your question about the politics, Republicans are almost as bad as the Democrats in terms of their unwillingness to completely and in a dedicated way fight these poisons.
Yep. About Eastern Europe, I think there's a paradox about Eastern Europe or Middle Europe or European countries that were behind the Iron Curtain or the part of former Yugoslavia. The, the paradox is that the fact that we didn't industrialize so fast, the fact that we didn't develop so fast, the fact that we went through communism, I think that this helped us
Yes.
in the sense that there wasn't so much immigration from Africa, Middle East, and so forth and so forth. So, for example, you'd see soccer games or football games where England would play Hungary and or Germany would play Hungary, and they would
Yes.
all take a knee for a criminal George Floyd or something like that, and the Hungarians would stand. But I do think that you're right. It's slowly. I mean, the people that want to ruin our by our, I mean, all white societies. They have all the media, and
Yeah.
through they have all the films, the culture,
Yes.
and they're gonna do it. They're gonna do it to us too.
Well, that's one of the terrible disservices that the United States is doing for the entire white world, and that is media. As you know, in Hollywood, all of the producers are super lefty, and they will produce these movies about wicked white people, wonderful and noble black people and Hispanics. And this kind of thinking will inevitably seep into the minds of people all around the world. Often these movies are very attractively produced with nice special effects, very pretty actresses. Everything is all very well produced, and it all adds to this idea that white people are the cancer of human history. If you tell people that enough times, then it becomes easier for them to believe it. Now, of course, you are better able to see what the psychological state of affairs is, certainly where you live, and in a more general way in the parts of the world, parts of the white world that were under communist rule for some time. I think one of the benefits, in a way, of living in an Eastern European country is the various languages that you speak. When people in the third world learn a foreign language, it's more likely to be Spanish, English, French, something like that. Nobody's going to learn Slovenian who's living in Uganda. Nobody's going to learn Hungarian. And so they're not going to come live, although, I mean, given a chance, many of them would move to an Eastern European country rather than live in the South Sudan or some such horrible place as that. But that's one of the reasons you are less likely to be targeted by this mass influx of third world people. Now, one of the things that white people have to learn, and this is something very, very difficult for them, they have to say, no, our country was built by our ancestors for us. It was not built for you. Sorry, you have got to stay home. One of the great defects of white people, which is not always a defect, is that they have this compulsion to be compassionate. There is a kind of craze among white people to look out for the underdog. Ever since about the second half of the 20th century, to be a good white person, you have to be a liberal in the sense of being in favor of equality, lifting up those who are downtrodden or those who are suffering. This mentality, if it's restricted to a homogeneous society and the people that you are helping are in fact your cousins or your brothers or your aunts or your uncles, it's not at all a bad impulse. But when this impulse is translated out into the whole world, and the people who we are lifting up and bringing into our own homes are not only people who are culturally different from us, religiously different, racially different from us, and who cannot adopt the standards by which we in the West live, then this is utter and total suicide. And that's why when I talk about the future for white people, I see white people as having a future only if they have societies in which they are the clear majority. Now, what would that society be like? It might be like Sweden in the high days of state socialism, so to speak, cradle to grave welfare state. That might work in a society in which everyone feels a sense of solidarity. And yes, if I pay high taxes to help people who are poor, those people are my people. Those people are my kinfolk. Or it could be a much more kind of rugged individualistic state, like the United States in the 19th century. Very little government support. You get ahead if you are capable. And the idea of charity is something that's voluntary, and individuals practice it if they choose. I don't really care what kind of society white people choose to live in, so long as that society is going to be one that is self-consciously white and recognizes that our people must have a place where they are the permanent supermajority. And so I don't like to get involved in these questions about, okay, what is the future ethno state going to look like politically? We'll work out those problems when the time comes. And at this point, I think it's wrong to say, okay, it's going to be 100% Christian. Well, no, it might not be. There might be pagans, there might be atheists, there might be many different people. But so long as they're white, they know it, and they're glad to be white, and they have that in common, we can work out any other kind of difference.
By white, you were never a Nordicist or Anglo-Saxon whiteist or whatever, because I see some people comment that Slavs or Serbs, Slovenes are probably not white for you, but you were never. I'm probably more of a Nordicist than you are. You come from a American perspective, where you see practically all the European immigrants as white, because you can testify that the majority of Europeans can fit in the civilization better than blacks, for example. That's
right.
your position.
And, even within Europe, the French, for example, have a fairly substantial population of Portuguese immigrants. Now, there are some Nordicists who will say, Portugal, there was a slave society, and every Portuguese has a certain percentage of black blood these days. The Portuguese have done just fine in French society. And essentially, I believe all Europeans can be assimilated in a healthy way into a European society, a kind of Western civilization. They don't have to be. I mean, we have Orthodox Christians, we have Catholics, we have Protestants, we have people who are none of those things. All of that can be worked out so long as we are Europeans. This is our family. And all families can have problems. But if the members of the family are loyal to their family, they can work these out. I think it is far too late to be speaking in terms of Nordicism. Now, I think it's entirely possible. If I had been living in the late 1800s in the United States, and at that time, it was very Northern European place, and somebody had said to me, we're going to get all these Sicilians, we're going to get all these Hungarians coming in, I might very well have said, don't much like that. Irish too? Maybe, perhaps. But once they were here, and it's not as though there were no conflicts. The Irish and the English didn't get along in the United States at first, just the way they didn't get along in Ireland, England, and the old country. But once they've been here, after 3 generations, essentially all European groups, with the exception of Jews, interestingly enough, all European groups are just as likely to be in the middle class, to go to university, and this is very important, and to marry outside their ethnic group. After they've been here for 3 generations, Hungarians are just as much likely to marry Germans as Romanians, for heaven's sake. Not that there are that many Romanians in the United States. And so there has been a kind of melting pot in the United States that was successful so long as the ingredients were European. And the idea of the melting pot used to be the ideal of America, and it would work so long as all of the different metals that were going into this brand new alloy were European. Now we simply cannot melt these things. You simply can't have Muslims and Africans and Indonesians and Chinese in large numbers. They just don't melt. They stay separate. So, yes, I was never a Nordicist, and at this point, it's far too late. We can't be drawing these artificial, or perhaps there is some kind of distinctive difference. I mean, there are people who think that blue-eyed people are somehow different from brown-eyed people or blonde people. It's too late. It's far too late for that stuff. We need all the friends we can get, and we need to work together. And if you're going to start some kind of racial consciousness movement in the United States, and you said, and the only people we're going to let in are people with blue eyes or blonde hair, that would be utterly crazy. We can all work it out. We're all part of the same family.
What about civilizationally or culturally? Do you think there's there's American culture, but how would you call this American culture? What's the source of this American culture?
Oh,
Is it Anglo-Saxon culture? Is it broadly speaking, European culture? Would you be, for example, okay if a Russian culture prevailed in a formerly or still majority Anglo-Saxon America?
well, it's very hard to imagine how that would happen. But ultimately, I would tell you this. If my descendants, if in order for them to live in a nation that affirms them as a people, recognize their value, and recognizes their history and culture, and ensures them a future, if for that purpose they have to learn Slovenian or Russian or Hungarian, then so be it. That is what matters to me. American culture, to the extent that I value it, is almost exclusively European culture. I mean, we have some aspects of it of our own. Thanksgiving Day, for example, is a very much an American thing. Trick-or-treating, for example, that's something that was really invented in the United States, the way we celebrate Halloween. There are various sort of folkloric things about the United States. We have certain kinds of food that are really indigenous to the United States and to the white people who lived here. All of those things, to me, no matter how desirable you might think them, are nothing compared to the heritage that we received from the Greeks, from the British, from, in fact, all of the great classical composers whose names Americans even find difficult to pronounce. All of that is vastly more important than trick-or-treat or Halloween or Thanksgiving. We are part of this magnificent succession of things that our white ancestors built and created. And that is what we must preserve. And if in order to do so, we must sacrifice some local wrinkles, then so be it. I think it's great to preserve all of the local aspects of the things that white people have created. I'm sure that Slovenians have customs, have their own heroes, their own ideas, and all of these things are wonderful. I don't want them to disappear. But the really important thing is what we have in common as white people.
How have you felt about religion through the time? I mean, if you look at it historically, do you think that there's something intrinsically anti-white in Christianity, or was the Christianity or the churches around the world? I mean, by that I mean Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Evangelical. Have they been subverted and subdued and
I would
what's
say
your yeah?
I would say the latter is the case. There's nothing intrinsically anti-white about Christianity, but there's nothing intrinsically pro-white either. But let us not forget that the people who colonized Africa, for example, the people who colonized Australia, those people were Christian. They were more Christian than Europeans and Americans are today. But they had absolutely no hesitancy in accepting that They, as white people, were the people destined to govern people who were at a less developed level of political organization. Those people were Christian. The people who instituted Black slavery in the United States, the people who had Jim Crow, segregation, all those people were Christians. They saw no contradiction between their Christianity and a very vivid consciousness of race. And so I think that what has happened to the churches is exactly the same thing that's happened to the universities, to the media, to the cultural institutions. Even religion has been subverted by this huge and utterly and ultimately suicidal wave of egalitarian thinking that practically all white people now suffer from. So, no, I don't think Christianity is inherently anti-white. I wish that Christianity had some kind of sense of white solidarity, but it's not that kind of religion. The Jewish religion is one that is really based on the history and experiences of a single people. And that is something that is more likely to maintain its role as something that produces ethnic or religious solidarity. But now there are even Jews in Israel, a certain number of them who want open borders and think Israel should be multicultural. And again, at the same time, let us not forget that, as I suggested earlier, there are many people who blame Christianity for the decline of white racial consciousness. But white people, at least in the last 1,000 years, there's never been a time when whites were less Christian. And at least in the United States, and I suspect the same is true in European countries as well, white people who are still serious Christians are less likely to be suicidal and anti-white than people who have no religion at all. So I think it's unfair to blame Christianity. At the same time, let us not forget that Christianity is tied up with so much of all of the aesthetics of Western civilization. Notre Dame Cathedral, the music of Bach, so much of Renaissance painting, for example. It's impossible to understand our heritage without understanding Christianity. It's not necessary to believe in Christianity to appreciate the beauty of Westminster Cathedral, for example. But this is part of our heritage, and I think it is a big mistake to ignore it. And as a number of people who have said, people who are partisans of the West, they may say they are even atheists. But as I believe it was Maria Fallaci, the Italian woman Fallaci, I've forgotten her first name now. She was a journalist. She was very much opposed to the Islamization of Europe. And somebody once asked her, well, what do you care about Islamization of Europe? You're an asserted atheist. She says, I'm a Christian atheist. And I think that is absolutely the attitude that people of the West should take. You may be an atheist, but if you're a white man, you should be a Christian atheist.
What's your opinion on ever more blacks, blacks as public figures speaking to certain extent against the Jews, to say so, because I know that the majority of people that ever spoke against the Jews were immediately marginalized. There are no people that talk against Jews in mainstream. No people. And some blacks were allowed to lately to speak against.
Well,
do you think there's some psyop behind this, or?
No, I don't think there's anything sinister or crazy or some sort of plot about it. I think there's no question Jews have a vastly disproportionate influence in the United States. And when it comes to any kind of political movement that is aiming to undermine the legitimacy of the racial consciousness of white people, or any political movements that encourage immigration which will reduce whites to a minority, you'll find that the Jewish influence in those movements has been very strong. There are some people who notice these things, and these things are utterly obvious and unmistakable. There are some people who notice these things, say, well, okay, that means all Jews are our enemies. I think that is a big mistake, because there is a certain number of Jews who realize what a terrible thing all of this is, and I think it is a big and costly mistake to then say exclude all Jews from any effort to save Western civilization. There are some Jews who I believe are very patriotic men of the West. They have enough Western genetics. They look for all intents and purposes white. And I believe that is a big mistake to say, okay, just because there are so many Jews that are subverting the interests of whites, all Jews are our enemies. I think that's a mistake. Now, there has long been a tradition of Black people denouncing Jews. There was a time, in the 1950s, for example, when in the Black neighborhoods in the United States, many of the shopkeepers, many of the landlords were Jews. And the Black people, it wouldn't have made any difference probably whether they were Jews or not, but they complained that these shopkeepers were cheating them, that the landlords were exploiting them. And so there has long been this idea among Blacks that Jews are shysters and they are the enemy. So it's not as though this is something that's brand new. The Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, has always taken a very dim view of Jews. So it's not as though this current of noticing the effect of Jews and talking in unflattering ways about Jews is something that's brand new. That's always been the case. There have been a few cases now that have come to a kind of national attention, and as usual, these people are being squelched. But it's really nothing new, and I don't think that it is anything that can be attributed to some kind of sinister motives. It's just a phenomenon that keeps cropping up because there are certain facts that people notice. In fact, there's a kind of irony here. If a Gentile says that the Jews run Hollywood, for example, that's supposed to be a horrible thing. But if Jews say, well, yeah, we're awfully influential in Hollywood, then, okay, they're just stating a fact. There was Joe Sobun is the name of a guy who used to write for National Review until he was kicked out for alleged anti-Semitism. He once said, once you start writing in a critical way about Jews, very soon you get the message from Jewish organizations, and that is, you must write about us always as if we are a powerless, vulnerable minority. And if you don't write about us that way, we will crush you.
Yeah.
Look, the whole question of the role of Jews in Gentile societies is a very interesting and significant one, but it's not one that my organization, American Renaissance, pays much attention to, except to say that, yes, it is true that organized Jewish interests are often put to work to the detriment of the interests of whites, but that does not mean that all Jews are our enemies, and unquestionably some Jews can be very important allies.
What about Jews as, for example, Ben Shapiro or honorary Jew Jordan B. Peterson?
Well, I don't know why you call him an honorary Jew. He's not Jewish, is he?
Well, my hypothesis is that he's probably a crypto Ashkenazi, but I've been calling him a honorary Jew because one, he's been employed for Daily Wire, and Ben Shapiro. Second, I saw a picture a couple of days ago with Benjamin Netanyahu and Ben Shapiro. They went to Israel, and he had lectures there. But there's another thing. He always promotes this notion of higher Jewish IQ, and he talks about Solzhenitsyn very selectively. For example, he doesn't want to talk about 200 years behind the another important book of Solzhenitsyn. He only talks about the Gulag archipelago, where
Yes.
he
Well,
via which he explains the evils of communism. Yet in the
right,
200
right.
years behind, Solzhenitsyn explains that all the communists, the majority of communists, were Jews, and he
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the book is called 400 Years Together, I think. Is it
I think it's
200?
200. Yeah,
200
I don't
years
know. Yeah, yeah,
together.
yeah.
In any
Together,
case, be that
probably.
as it may, we'll take Shapiro. I don't pay that much attention to what he says, but on balance, is he better for the United States than Nancy Pelosi or any number of Gentiles? He has a generally conservative view on immigration, for example, or fiscal policy, some of the craziness of Black identity politics. I think on balance, believe me, there are plenty of Gentile white people who are, I think, far worse for our country and for our people than Ben Shapiro. And again, Jews and Gentiles, you can find them at every edge of at every end and every point on the political spectrum. And it's certainly the case that Jews are more likely to be on the dangerous and destructive end. But there are those who are on the good end. If you took, for example, Episcopalians, many of them are notoriously liberal. You could find them all lining up behind all of these crazy ideas. But to then say all Episcopalians are our enemy is a mistake. Now, given the kind of history that Jews have had in all of the pro-immigration and anti-racial consciousness movements, I can understand a certain resentment towards Jews for that reason. And many Jews who understand the effect that their co-religionists have had are equally critical of Jews. But again, the Jews who really do consider themselves part of Western civilization and are willing to sacrifice and fight for it, I think it's crazy not to accept them as allies.
What about ideologies? For example, individualism. The individualism that, for example, okay, let Shapiro out, and let's talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson. He openly discusses this topic that he wants to save young white people with his psychological whatever this is, to not go down the rabbit hole of collectivism, for example. He openly
Yes,
discusses this. He's against white people having any collective identity. He says this is bad.
right.
Is this bad for white people?
Yes, it's terrible for white people. Now, I think someone like Jordan Peterson, he would say Black people should not have a collective identity either. He would say Hispanics also should not. This is the general conservative position in the United States. They are opposed to Black identity politics or any kind of racial identity politics. And they would say Blacks shouldn't do it, but especially white people shouldn't do it. Or they may simply say whites shouldn't do it any more than Blacks. So they take a consistent position. But what they fail to understand is Blacks will always have identity politics, and every non-white group exercises their interests on a racial basis. This cannot be changed. And if they have their way, and if they increase in number, then white people will face oblivion. Oppression, oblivion, we will disappear. This is something that white conservatives refuse to accept. And when it is only white people who have dismantled any sense of racial solidarity, while everyone else is gearing up racial solidarity, organizing their politics and their lives and their media in their own particularist interest, this is unilateral disarmament in a very, very dangerous world. This is like living in a small country surrounded by big countries and saying, well, we don't like war, and war means killing, and war means having weapons. So we're going to throw all our weapons away. That is what white people are doing psychologically. Now, the odd thing is, that was the whole idea of the American Civil Rights Movement. All racial groups were going to throw away any kind of sense of racial solidarity, and we were all going to be Americans, individual Americans. Well, white people kept their end of the bargain. Almost all white people said, okay, I'm going to treat Black people and Asians and everybody else just like everybody else. So it's all going to be colorblind America. Well, nobody else did that. Black people were never going to be colorblind. Hispanics were never going to be colorblind. Asians were less racially solidarity, had less racial solidarity, but now they too are increasingly discovering just how many benefits it brings. So they are practicing racial politics. It's only white people who are not allowed to. And this is part of the utter stupidity and the hopelessness of American conservatives, that they don't take the obvious next step and say, okay, everybody else is arming. And for us to have thrown our weapons away is suicidal. That is the step that they are unwilling to take.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Oh gosh, final thoughts. Well, I would say only that despite the many setbacks that whites have faced, certainly in the United States and essentially around the world, I'm optimistic. This is a very long-term phenomenon. We Europeans have had a civilization that goes back all the way to the Greeks. And I do not believe that white people will simply disappear. Here in the United States, more and more white people are waking up to the terrible challenges that we face. And I think that we are mobilizing in ways we never have before. We have much, much work to do, but this is going to be a marathon. And I'm convinced that ultimately we white people will have a future that is as glorious as our glorious past.
Okay, thank you for this final thought. Thanks for accepting my invitation. Thank you for an hour of your time and your always subtle and intelligent and lucid thoughts. I hope we can meet each other often this year and not take it so long as we did from the last time we heard each other. So. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. Goodbye.
Pleasure's all mine. Bye.